Hi, everyone. I feel like I'm about to give a presidential address or something. It's very official. Super excited to be here to start our next panel, meeting the voters on the platforms they live on. Really hard to follow up that last panel if you all were watching. Some amazing creative that came out of this cycle, both from the acronym team and also all of our partners. So we're going to talk about media, which is definitely not as sexy as creative, unfortunately, but is just as important. And one of the biggest learnings that we took away from this cycle is that sweet spot, that intersection between creative and media, and really how do the two work together in tandem to drive impact. So if you go to the next slide, please. To introduce myself, I am Shannon Kowalczyk. During the cycle, I was Chief Marketing Officer at Acronym, so oversaw all of our creative media buying, data and analytics, as well as our communications team. Now I am the newly appointed CEO of Lockwood Strategy, as we are sort of expanding and rotating outward to work with clients in the progressive and democratic space beyond Acronym. And just by way of background, I come from the world of both corporate marketing as well as politics. I worked for years at big agencies with brands like Walgreens and Sprint. And then in 2012 went to the Obama re-election campaign, which is where I met Tara, and have been working in politics in various places ever since, most recently at Pandora. I will let my fellow panelists introduce themselves. Kat.
Hi, I'm Kat Stern. I know you might have seen me on the panel earlier today, but I'm the media director here at Lockwood. We oversaw all of the 2020 cycle programs for Acronym and Pacronym. So Expand the Electorate, which was the voter registration and turnout program, as well as Four is Enough, which was our negative Trump pro-Biden program. We also partnered with a few others, specifically around now Vice President Kamala Harris and around the Senate races in Georgia. Sarah, you want to intro yourself?
Hi, everyone. Great to be talking to you all today. I'm Sarah. I'm a media planner with Lockwood. I have been with the organization since 2018 when I came on as an ad ops associate. So I've gotten to see a lot of the different parts of the media programs and really dig into the platforms for the last few years. Over time, I've worked on most of Acronym and Pacronym's core programs, starting with state legislative work in 2018, some voter registration work in 2019, and then last year, I spent most of my year planning and budgeting the media buys for the Four is Enough program, which, as Kat said, is the Acronym Pacronym anti-Trump pro-Biden campaign. And then toward the end of the cycle, I also did most of the planning for our partnership around the Georgia Senate race and runoff elections and our partnership with Senate Majority PAC and Majority Forward.
Great. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. So what are we here to talk about today? Specifically, how do we distribute all of those beautiful ads that we just saw in the last panel and get in front of the right people that we need to talk to in order to create an impact? What's the problem? It's not easy. The internet is a very big place and keeps getting bigger. And while there's been lots of talk about the impact that Facebook has had on this election, and certainly it is a platform that impacts a lot of opinions and just the sort of media narratives that flow through there. We know that it is not in and of itself the only place where voters spend their time. We're all people, we all vote, hopefully, and some of us may be on Facebook a few minutes here, a few minutes there, but we go to many other places throughout our day. And in order to have an impactful program, we really need to be thinking about the bigger picture. Voter attention is hard to come by. Anybody's attention is hard to come by for anybody, right? We go through getting millions and millions of messages thrown at us, every week, whether it's from our friends, whether it's from other brands, whether it's from our elected leaders or news organizations, advertisers online. There's always stuff in our way as we're sort of going through our day, and it's becoming less and less likely that if we pay to put an ad out there, that people will automatically watch it or read it or engage with it. And so, as we think about how we strategize from a media perspective, that's of particular importance to keep in mind. And then everything is constantly changing. If all of this weren't hard enough, this year was the most dynamic year I think that has ever existed in my professional life. Just thinking about all of the things that happened in this country, world events in the news, but not only that, those things really changed how people consumed the internet and used the internet. Real world events have a real impact on digital spaces and vice versa, which we're seeing right now with Reddit single-handedly changing the stock market. And so facing all of that, that changing nature of everything is also something that you really have to consider as you're thinking about building your media strategy. Next slide. Cool. So our playbook, the way that we've structured this, as we kind of talked about last year, and what the media playbook was that we used, was we came up with 5 core tenets of the philosophy of how we approach media planning and buying, and how we built out our programs for Acronym. So we're just going to talk about each of these with each slide, and I'm going to throw some questions over to Sarah and Kat to talk about specific examples from the programs that we ran. I encourage you all to ask questions on the Q&A platform and or upvote questions. We will save some time at the end to answer. Okay, so the biggest part of our philosophy is expanding our understanding of where voters spend their time. As I said, the internet is bigger than Facebook. Certainly a lot of people are there, but where else are people, and what has happened over the last year that has changed the way that people consume media and where their attention is really focused. Certainly things like the pandemic really shifted media consumption behaviors. And so we had to be really tuned into how those things shifted. As part of our programs, we tested and scaled a huge and diverse mix of media platforms. When you talk about digital media, you're not just talking about the internet and websites. You're talking about apps. You're talking about social media platforms. You're talking about audio streaming platforms. You're talking about video streaming platforms. You're talking about mobile web, OTT, that plays on television sets. And so it's this huge space that you have to consider when you're thinking about where your audience is and how you're going to reach them. What we really aim to do is create this messaging bubble around our audience. We've talked about how important it is to build a narrative and have all these different types of creative that reach people in different ways, but all ladder up to this same message. We have to do that same thing with our media placements. So I want to go to Kat first and just ask, how did the team think about developing our media mix for each audience specific to the different programs that we ran?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's really not a one size fits all approach. We really want to take a step back and understand who the audience is and understand what their consumption habits are. And then we'll recommend sort of a media mix and the various platforms based upon that. I think as an example, it really depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a persuasion audience, which we typically classify as swing voters or undecided voters, we know that they might not necessarily want to see our messages. So we need to kind of get creative about how we're delivering them. We find that non-skippable ads for an audience like that is really important, where they're kind of in a situation where they will have to view the ad. We have that on YouTube, connected TV, OTT. It's really about understanding the audience and kind of where they're spending their time and building the platforms around that. I think for Expand Electorate, which I talked about a little bit earlier today, we knew that we could reach a younger people of color audience on Facebook and more Instagram. But we also wanted to consider other platforms because we could be missing some younger people who might not be on Facebook anymore or might spend way less time on it. So we also tested other platforms like Google search and YouTube and programmatic display just to kind of get, to be in more places than just, I think, Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook's totally lame for really young people, right? It's no longer
yeah, everyone's leaving.
So it's funny you were talking about the persuasion audience in particular and us having to try and talk to people who don't want to hear from us. I always say that as having worked in politics and also outside of politics, politics is really the only marketing industry where we have to talk to people who don't want to hear from us. And we have to continue building that conversation with those people, right? In any other industry, really, whoever's, you have a target audience and you're going to go sell sneakers to keep going with what Victor was talking about. You're going to optimize your program to whoever is engaging with your content and is willing to buy your sneaker. But in politics, there is a very specific set of people that you need to impact. And those are the people that can swing an election. And you don't care if they want to hear from you or not. So it's a much different challenge. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about specifically building the media mix for our Four is Enough program?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Kat was talking about with a persuasion audience, we do want more forced view environments. I think especially when you're thinking about Four is Enough, I'm sure what everyone has heard already is that we intentionally went after a lower knowledge audience. So I think even more so, that's people who aren't necessarily like going to CNN or the New York Times or something like that. So I think we tried to think really intentionally about, what publishers, for example, would be a good fit. Perhaps out of all the networks, maybe CBS is seen as like a more median kind of partisanship or so. So that was something that we thought about. And then also, thinking about how can we reach these people, again, in multiple places with some of the same types of content too. So talked a lot about boosted news on Facebook, expanding that to run native advertising through Outbrain. That meant that when people were just surfing the web wherever, that we could place those news articles around them too. So they didn't necessarily have to be seeking out news content. It's just kind of hitting them with the headlines wherever they go. I think one thing we do know a lot about boosted news content is people aren't necessarily clicking through. The headline is really valuable. So trying to find a way to kind of pepper that, as you said, Shannon, sort of like in this information bubble around them, because it's not necessarily what they're going after. So I think thinking about strategically, putting in some more like entertainment options, and then also just not relying heavily on people going to the source and seeking it out.
Yeah, I think that's also a really important point, is what we really focus on ultimately in media is reach and frequency when we're talking about driving a message. We don't expect people to click on an ad. We don't even think clicking on an ad is a good indicator that they've been persuaded or that they're, a key voter that we want to bring along with us. It's really about that reach and frequency. And there was a question earlier about boosted news. And are we driving people to click through and read the article, or is the headline and image and description enough? And really it is. I mean, that's what we were optimizing towards is the pushing out of the content rather than the pulling in.
Absolutely. And I think that's also recognizing for each individual type of creative, what value does this bring? Again, for boosted news, a lot of it is that like sort of face value headline. I'm sure we all have opinions on what that means for our democracy at large, but that is kind of the reality of things. But then similarly, there's so much more message that you can get across in a great video as well. Trying to think about how we can package those videos too in sort of smaller messages. Our creative team always hated me because I was like, sorry, 15s only, no 30s, please. Just because we did really have to think about who this audience was, front loading that message. And there's just more non-skippable inventory for 15. So that's all something that we thought a lot about when we were kind of crafting the whole program together.
That's a really great segue into the next slide, which is the second part of our philosophy, which is really considering the context of the creative and where we were putting that. So if you can switch to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So this is really where that the media and the creative come together. I had an old boss who called it creatia, which is a funny word, but like it's so important to consider that combination of the two things, because we can put ads everywhere, but if we don't think about how they're going to be experienced by the people who receive them, and we don't actually customize the experience for them, then there's much less likelihood that they're going to break through and people are going to pay attention and they're going to make some sort of impact. So, we thought about that with all of our placements, and really the key things that we considered were the environment. Is it, a feed where there's lots of stuff going on and it's a very busy environment and people are just kind of scrolling through? Is it a forced view, lean forward video environment? Is it an audio streaming environment where somebody might be running or cooking and doing something else and a little bit distracted? Are they going to have headphones in? Are they going to have their sound on? All of these things were important things for us to consider. Kat, can you talk a little bit about how we did this? I want to talk about the Snapchat example specifically with cheat sheet, which we talked about in the last panel. But can you give just a little download on what cheat sheet was and how we considered the context with that creative?
Yeah, definitely. Also, Sarah can set the stage kind of around that in a minute, around the specific creative and what we did. But cheat sheet, again, it was really meant to be it was a partnership with Alana Glazer, which was really exciting. She was interviewing various celebrities, really to help us drive enthusiasm for Biden. And we thought this really worked with our turnout audience that we were trying to reach for this, which this audience was a little bit younger, more female, more people of color. So trying to get them all into that conversation was really important to us. We ran on like Snapchat, which I think was a really great place, and also YouTube for this audience. But I'll let Sarah talk a little bit about like what we did specifically with this creative.
Yeah, so we were promoting this web series to our audience and then to a larger, kind of broader youth audience who we thought could really be, helped by this creative. It was very educational. It was very motivational. All those videos were housed on a microsite that had even more information on the election, on state elections. And, we wanted people to really feel empowered. So when we were first promoting this series, we were directing people to the site where the videos lived. And one kind of quandary we had with Snapchat was that our action rate once people got to the site was very low, but we really were, pretty sure that that platform was a great fit for the people who we wanted to reach. So we kind of dug deeper in the platform offerings and actually found a different kind of placement where you would be served the ad just the same as you would on any other platform, 15-second ad. And then instead of swiping up to go to the website, you would swipe up and the long form video is actually housed within the app itself. So keeping people actually on the app ended up definitely driving a lower view rate, just more actions, more engagement with the content. And there are similar offerings on YouTube, which we also tried, YouTube discovery ads, where you run an ad on YouTube, and then people can go watch the actual video again housed on YouTube itself. We did have some light profanity in our videos, so we didn't end up getting to take full advantage of that. But I think there's so many options like that out there that aren't necessarily things we fit into like a traditional political media plan, that it can be kind of cut and dry depending on how you do it. And, we obviously try not to, and try to seek out what are some other things that are made for these different industries that we can take advantage of. So that was definitely something we got to play around with a little bit more with cheat sheet.
Yeah. The other place where we did this was with the boosted news, which we've been talking about. And I know that we ran tests early on and really got to understand better how Facebook would prioritize the delivery of boosted news depending on what type of news it was and what messenger it was coming from. Can you guys talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that was something, just a really interesting tidbit from our work earlier in the year. I had like really gotten it in my head that I wanted to run this test that would be an AP article versus a syndicated article from a local news source that was the same AP article, same headline, everything. We set it up in a split test within Facebook and then realized, oh, these look like exactly the same, except for a little tiny like link above the headline that would say like, oh, this is the source that it's from. We decided to still go through with it. And what we ended up seeing, we ran the test in 3 different states at the same time with the same kind of setup. And we saw at some level of statistical significance in every state that the syndicated article one had a lower cost per click. So we unpacked that and dug in a little bit more, saw that the click-through rates were actually very similar. But what happened was the cost to serve the syndicated articles were cheaper across the board, sometimes by over $1, which we thought was very interesting. And I think that kind of plays in with Facebook changes. In 2018, they announced algorithm changes that prioritize friends and family and groups and more local content that felt relevant to people. They have relevancy scores in Ads Manager. That's a big focus for them. And we also know around the same time that they started investing in local news, actually, and in reviving local news. So what we kind of took from this is that the local news being more relevant is actually playing the algorithm and helping us deliver that better. So I think we would love to test this even more and dig in more on that. But, sometimes the messenger is obviously makes something a lot more relevant to your audience and they might, receive it better, but also that relevancy, I think all of the platforms are trying to kind of build that into their algorithm. So localizing something is never going to hurt. That was just something we found really interesting.
Yeah, and certainly the platforms themselves control a lot of this context and what we can actually do. And we'll get to that a little later. I'm sure everybody has questions about all of the rules and how we're adapting to that. But I want to go to the next slide, which talks specifically about audience. We've talked about platforms and diversifying your content mix. We've talked about making sure that you're thinking about the creative that goes there and making it fit the placement. But also important is who you're talking to and how you find them. And digital has been known from the very beginning for being a great place to have a lot of data and a lot of ways to find a target audience. I think we have found in general that our best approach is really a layered approach. If you have a specific set of people you want to reach, putting all your eggs in one basket and trying to reach them in one particular way isn't really going to maximize the number of people that you can talk to on a regular basis. You have to take a look at the full library of offerings that are available across, the targeting available across all the different platforms and really layer your approach in trying to reach people. So I want to ask Kat specifically, one of the big things in politics, of course, is always the voter file and how do we want to use the voter file and target those folks? How do we think about that? And how did we use the voter file in some of the programs that we ran or didn't use it?
Yeah, I think matching to voter list is super important because that's the closest way we can get the idea of people who voted specific ways and reach them. But as you know, the value of having a mix of targeting is really important beyond just targeting people with voter file because, the data is not always perfect. I mean, people could have moved, and didn't update their information. There's a lot of variables around that data that we need to consider. And also, we don't want to miss the pockets of our audience who potentially vote infrequently because those are also people we want to make sure we're talking to. For
just
example,
like with ETE, where we had really terrible data, right, that you guys talked about earlier on the panel, and couldn't use first party targeting at all, and so had to rely on platform targeting.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we really had to lean into exclusion lists, because we can use the platform targeting, which is behavioral targeting or sometimes third-party segments they have available, and then de-target people that we know who are registered. So we're able to like kind of take them out of the fold. And we did quite a bit of that with 4 is Enough towards the end, where we were removing people who have already voted. So we weren't like reaching them after we have voted them. And I think Sarah can talk a little bit about that too. But the other thing is, some platforms don't allow you to actually match lists, from a political policy standpoint, which is another thing that we kind of have to navigate. So for example, with YouTube, for some of the Senate runoff work we did, we really knew that like being on YouTube is really important for younger audiences. So we're not able to match lists, that's restricted, but we can use a combination of age, gender, geo, and work really closely with the Google team to set up some contextual packages. So we only serve around certain content that we can kind of like have an idea about who this audience is. But again, it's kind of like, you really have to be creative in some capacity. And the other thing is that these rules are constantly changing. So just being kind of flexible and able to pivot as they do.
Yeah. So Sarah, can you talk a little more about the YouTube example? Because I think in trying to figure out what was the right mix of contextual targeting combined with these other things, we did some brand lift studies to sort of validate that. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, totally. I think it's so important, again, as all of these platforms change, add new sort of policies and regulations, political ads, that we think about all of the tools they have available still to us. So one thing we really took advantage of for the 4 is Enough campaign at the beginning of the year was brand lift studies. So we all think of that as something we can use to test the impact of the program, which is obviously true, but it's also useful to see the baseline. If you don't know for sure, what this audience actually believes in, or if you're kind of cobbling together contextual interests, the baseline is almost just as interesting and important as the lift that you get in your treatment audience. So we, for 4 is Enough, had 2 contextual packs, so we kind of had different theories of why they might be a persuadable audience and ran that brand lift to them. And we did see one did have a lower baseline that was more movable, which was really interesting. And also digging into that, there were subsegments that were driving that more. So men were more persuadable, and then the women in the group were already more progressive, which is not necessarily surprising to any of us. But if we did want to go after a more, persuadable group of women, that would require different sort of contextual packages. So it's really something that you can kind of learn, see what happens, play around with it, try some different things. I think a lot of those tools are available when we do have to get creative, that we can still get creative and back it up with some data at the end. So that is just something that we always try to keep in mind.
That's great. I want to move on to the next slide, because something that's been a common thread through all of these points is that things were constantly changing and we had to adapt. And that's really, I think, the biggest headline coming out of this year is just stay flexible. Build your systems in a way that they are flexible. Expect things to change, because they will. I mean, we went through a global pandemic, still are, protests in the streets, the president threatening to send in troops to our cities. We went through fake news being, distributed across all the social platforms, and sort of feeding misinformation to people. We went through economic challenges because of the pandemic. We went through election law literally changing on a state-by-state basis because of the pandemic. Early voting deadlines being pushed up or extended because of that. And so in the face of all of this, our messaging changed, our targeting changed. We knew the consumption of our audiences was changing. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we adapted to that. In particular, I think a good place to start is what happened when COVID struck, right? We had been running this program since October of 2019, hitting Trump on, his tax plan and some other things. And then all of a sudden in February, late February, this started to become a real thing. And we needed to pivot our entire program. So can you guys talk a little bit about how we responded from a media perspective?
Yeah. So, it's funny. We had the idea toward the end of February, before lockdowns happened or anything, to throw up a rapid response Google search campaign around Trump's coronavirus policy. But at the time, Google was treating anything coronavirus related as a sensitive event, and they wouldn't run ads around it. So we really wanted to pivot the messaging to talk about coronavirus, because we recognize that this is going to be one of the biggest issues in the election. And yet some of the platforms were really hesitant to let that happen at the beginning. When we decided to pivot all of our messaging, we had to check in with all of our vendors and say, are we allowed to run this? Because that was something we weren't sure about. Once we kind of got our feet under us, we also got a lot of signals that local news consumption was really blowing up. People were trying to see what was happening in their towns or their states, what was happening with lockdowns. So we did invest more in ads through local news publishers at that point, and kind of kept that going until we saw more news, like coronavirus news fatigue later in the summer. But that was something we wanted to really take advantage of as people were trying to figure out, how does this impact my day-to-day life? We wanted to be there and let them know that President Trump was failing to adequately respond to the pandemic. So that was definitely a big thing, transitioning over to focusing on local news.
Yeah, and it was like consumption habits were really changing drastically too. Like people were spending more time than they ever have watching connected TV and binge watching shows, and lots of companies were pulling their ad dollars at that time because they didn't really no one knew kind of what was going to happen. So there was tons of inventory available because not only were people pulling ad dollars, more people were spending time online. So all of our costs started to go down during that time, which was kind of crazy.
Which is interesting, because that's the opposite of what we always experience right before an election, where costs just skyrocket. I think we were paying just ridiculous CPMs across the platforms towards the end.
Yeah.
Also, Kat, you had the specific experience with ETE on the election stuff, and some of our ads having to be changed at the last minute because of the changing rules around early voting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think Facebook is really good at changing the rules after they set them. So we made a plan to have specific creative that listed out early vote is ending soon, vote today, vote tomorrow, specific creative with call to actions that was really helpful for the voter to see what, the context of what the ad was. And again, with that, 3 weeks before, when we were finding out there was going to be a new creative ads ban specifically for political ads or any ads about voting, we kind of had to just rethink everything that we were doing. And a lot of that was adding specific dates to creatives or adding specific dates in copy, which hadn't been communicated to us earlier. So it was a little bit, a little challenging, frankly. And also, we had so many different dates and so many different states that we were in, and poll close times were changing. And, there was just so many real life things happening, kind of, Shannon, what you were talking about, where the actual events of what was going on was having such a direct impact on what we were doing. But the biggest thing for us, I think, was just constantly trying to stay flexible and understanding that, I feel like our team kind of knew that there was going to be chaos when Facebook decided to make some changes so late in the game. They weren't really set up for it necessarily. So we had to be as prepared and pretty much, ready for anything.
Yeah. So that's a great segue to the last point, which is if you go to the next slide, which is how we sort of navigated the reality of these platform mandates to control, what's happening on their platform and how that impacts their ad policies. So, and I know we only have a few minutes left, so I want to get to some questions. But I think just in regards to this, Kat, what you were just talking about is really the key point here, right? Is like you have to be a student of what's happening. Facebook sends out these very long emails with lots of words about what they're going to do. And, you have to make sure that your entire team is aware of what's happening and is really curious about how that's going to impact different parts of the platform and what you can do. Because a lot of times we were learning in real time, along with lots of other organizations who were also buying Facebook ads, what that meant for us, which was challenging, but that's life. I do want to get to some of the questions before we hop off. The first one is about ROI, which I think is a good one to talk about in the context of our Expand the Electorate program, because that was really focused on a direct response initiative. Although we didn't necessarily measure return on investment, it was more about driving people to register to vote. But Kat, are there any platforms in particular that produced a surprising or disappointing ROI? And why do you think that was the case? And I think in particular, can you talk about Georgia when Facebook was down and we couldn't advertise there, and what else we tested?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for the Georgia campaign specifically, our audience was people who didn't register for the general. So that's even more specific of an audience. So it was people of color in Georgia who didn't register for the general, trying to reach them and making sure they register before the Georgia runoff. And Shannon was right. Facebook was down because after the November 3rd election, Facebook said, no more Facebook ads indefinitely. And we kind of had to use some of the testing knowledge that we had from like June and July earlier, where we tested running with like some audio. We're able to run with Spotify and Pandora to kind of test to see how that could get us some direct response, because there is a banner ad that you can click through and go to the site. We also have had a ton of success with Snapchat, which we continued to run through this phase. The biggest part that I think was a little bit disappointing is I think we hadn't really gotten quite what we were hoping with some of the programmatic we were running for direct response. I think it's hard to get people to engage on desktop with a banner ad, frankly. I think we saw much stronger performance specifically like around mobile, like people on mobile driving there, because it's a little bit bigger and it's a better experience. So I think those are like a couple of the things that I would say about exactly that.
Cool. I just wanted to fit in one more question. Maybe Sarah, you can help with this. What key processes helped your team manage being live across so many platforms? Did you build your own tools?
Yes, the loaded question. A little triggering, but yes, I think we had to do a lot of preparation work on the front end. And I think that's something that we were able to do because the program was so long with 4 is Enough. We were able to, over time, suss out what the issues were and sort of build things to fix those. We ran an obscene amount of Facebook ads, in part because we were segmenting our audience to be able to control frequencies across age. So every time you add that other variable, it obviously turns into a million other ads. It kind of multiplies things out. So we actually developed bulk import tools for Facebook, as well as some other platforms to help us manage the actual ad upload. And the ad building time also minimizes, issues. So QA was more efficient. In terms of media planning, there was also a ton of sort of fancy spreadsheet stuff that we did at the front end to make our media plans really responsive and able, phase to phase, that I could just plug in new numbers in one place and then have budgets kind of get spit out based on the new CPMs or reach rates or whatever I wanted to tweak based on what we had seen in previous phases. So I think there was a lot of work that we had to do on the front end there. I would say we're a very scrappy team. We're a team that likes to make our own tools and figure out how to get from A to B. And we also have a very thoughtful team that's able to put in a lot of thought into process and how we can all work together to get the job done. So there's a lot that we had to do to kind of get everything done. And the earlier you can start that, the better is how I'll end that.
Yes, that's a common theme, I think, across all of these panels. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we're out of time. I don't know if you want to go to the next slide quickly. We had, just a summary of the key takeaways. Make sure you're expanding, diversifying your media mix. Consider the context of where you're putting your ads. Get creative about how you find your audience. Stay flexible and be careful in navigating platform policies. If you guys have follow-up questions, there's lots of information I know on the Acronym Playbook website. We're always around, at Lockwood Strategy, so please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever. Thanks for joining.